Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show, and I'm your host, Miko Bits. And today I have an exciting show for you. It's David Sneider from the Lit Protocol. So, Lit Protocol is working on some very exciting developer infrastructure for Web3, and it involves NFTs as well as fungible token access control mechanisms. So, this is a foundational developer layer just for sake of disclosure, my fund, Gumi Cryptos Capital, is invested in Lit Protocol. So just so you all know. And I guess without further ado, here's David. Thanks for joining the Miko Bits show.
Thanks, Miko. Really excited to be here, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always open the same way, which is, what is the problem solved by your project?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a few ways to look at this, either at the application level or at the infrastructure level. I can give you an anecdote of how we arrived at this solution and the problem we were trying to specifically solve, and then can talk you through a couple other kind of problem cases that decentralized access control solves. About a year and a half ago, my co-founder Chris said, "Hey, David, look at this." And it was an HTML NFT. And at the time, we were running in a what you see is what you get NFT marketplace. And for me, that was the light bulb moment. It was like, oh, of course you can point an NFT at an HTML file. And in a way, it kind of like conceptually fell inside of the NFT frame and was like, these things aren't just video screens or picture frames. These are private browser windows that exist in a platformless type of way. And then so that begged the obvious next question, which is, what is the type of infrastructure that we need to create to make that statement true? And that's how we landed at decentralized access control. So to describe the problem in a more general sense, basically, if you think about a user's or an individual's or an organization like a DAO's blockchain history and wallet holdings as credentials, and you have a bunch of resources that are not on chain, whether it's encrypted files on decentralized storage or live streams hosted by a centralized CDN. How do you take that on-chain credential and basically treat it as the access key or token to that off-chain resource? And bridging that gap is where decentralized access control fits.
I think this is a really big deal. And I think one of the reasons why we should think about it this way is that one of the things that fungible tokens provide for so-called Web3 is mechanisms for things like payment, right? But the thing that's very interesting is right now what we're limited in buying is we're limited in buying kind of on-chain assets, right? So the thing that's kind of interesting is, what if every possible other thing or access to anything could be, something that people could use these, beautiful payment rails to buy, right? So, you could buy access or, you could basically, and obviously there's so many ways to play with this technology. So for example, you could have, an NFT represent access to, gated chat rooms or web conferences or anything you can imagine. So, I guess for me, like, what are the top three things that you're working on that, I think relate to, enabling people to gain access through having on-chain conditions?
Yeah, excellent. So there's something unique about this decentralized access control network that we're working on here, and that is that the network itself also is maintaining a secret. And so what I mean by that is this isn't just a validator network that says we're confirming the credential as a trusted party, and then like telling a service provider. So at the top of that list is the capacity to do access control to encrypted information. And that has a couple kind of different sub implications, whether it's an organization that wants to host their data on decentralized storage and use an updatable array of addresses in a smart contract, essentially as the ACL or access control list. that type of capacity is super exciting and has a lot of implication and kind of how can individuals own their own data type of way. And as mentioned, the same thing also applies to individuals. So if you think about when you go into your Google settings and you see the list of all of the applications that you've authorized to kind of view your Google data, it starts to get really interesting when instead of you telling Google, hey, let vendor A use my Google data, if that data is yours and self-sovereign, and you're basically giving the right to a vendor to decrypt some of your data. So that's a generalized thing, and there's a few examples in that. And then the other kind of two things to kind of round out the list are one, just making this so easy for developers. We've got a JavaScript SDK. There's certainly a lot of like encryption complexity beneath the hood, and we can get into some of the architecture. But we've seen teams implement this for things like doing encrypted private messaging on decentralized storage in as little as a day. So really being able to make it just easy to implement this inside of one's application wherever they see fit. And then finally is kind of the capacity to connect this to Web 2 apps. So we built a couple reference implementations with like Shopify and Zoom and GatherTown and Google Drive for doing token gated spaces or token gated webinars. Like, and the Shopify example is you can use your on-chain credential, otherwise known as the NFTs in your wallet, as a mechanism for a discount or an exclusive drop in e-commerce.
So where can people go and see some of this stuff?
Yeah. So kind of the showcase of the applications that are live today are at litgateway.com, and then the protocol site is at litprotocol.com, and of course we're active in Discord, hanging out there, and on Twitter.
Yeah, definitely recommend people can go see this. So, one thing that I think is amazing right now is that it's fairly obvious that our current internet infrastructure isn't meeting our needs. One of the things people can do is they can go onto the dark web and they can download a file with 8 billion name password pairs on it, right? So the idea that we currently have this beautiful role-based access control mechanism for the internet called, name password pairs, and that these things are being used on like 1,000 websites and no one can remember their password. So they're either insanely, insecurely repeating the same password everywhere, or they're using a password manager, which is basically some kind of really insane kind of mechanism to mitigate how stupidly this is designed, right? So, I think the 8 billion name password pairs you can buy, on the dark web, is very indicative that this is just broken, right? So in a sense, the intranet for Web3 could be based on something like Lit Protocol, right? Which is the idea that there are places that you just can't randomly stumble into, or even crack your way into, right? And all of this is based on blockchain tech. That means that it's insanely adversarial and rugged. And, so can you talk a little bit about sort of like the cryptographic security of your system?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of really interesting points that you mentioned in there that we can also unpack. As it relates to security, there's basically two core layers of the security. One, when the network kind of generates a secret, it does so with something called distributed key generation, and then the secret shares are stored across the nodes of the network using BLS threshold cryptography. So I'll get into a little bit of a technical architecture here. Basically, like if you upload a file to IPFS, you'll do client-side encryption, so it is encrypted in your browser, and then that generates basically a data key or an access key, which you immediately encrypt with the Lit protocol network public key, and then that key is destroyed. And then you associate a set of access control conditions. For example, anybody who owns a given NFT, those are hashed and stored. And then let's say I own the NFT that you wanted to give access to that file. When I come along later, I sign a message with my wallet that's broadcast to the nodes of the Lit protocol. You kind of think about it like BitTorrent, where there's a bunch of different parties that are responsible for a certain part of the operation. Those nodes call down to the blockchain, check the credential, ensure that I have the NFT, and then using BLS, basically each of those nodes creates a decryption share, and BLS is a threshold-based implementation, and then each of those nodes send the decryption share to me. I aggregate the shares above the threshold, and then can reproduce the initial data key and access that content that you've encrypted. And then another layer of security that we have in here is all of the operations on the nodes are taking place inside of a secure execution environment as well. But I also want to come back to something that you mentioned around like the notion of the universal login, and certainly where we're at with like kind of sign in with Ethereum or sign in with unstoppable domains or sign in with ENS is very, very cool. But if you think about how when you do sign in with Facebook or sign in with Google, it's not just validating you are who you say you are, but there's also some other information about you. It's like, I am who I say I am, and also here's some relevant metadata that the application needs in order to be able to provide the service that I require. So I'm really excited about what's happening with kind of the sign in with wallet today, and think there's some more kind of steps in progress to move in that direction. And these are some of the things that we're excited about, like as a project as well.
Yeah, and I like the advanced cryptography. Obviously BLS threshold encryption. Obviously, as is kind of traditional for the cryptography schemes. A lot of these cryptography three-letter acronyms actually represent the creators,
Correct.
the mathematicians, etc. So the B is Dan Bonnet at Stanford, a pretty legendary blockchainer and very awesome cryptographer. So BLS threshold cryptography, for those of you who are curious, like it's used fairly extensively in Ethereum too. It's also used extensively in Credo, which is another one of our kind of multi-party compute driven backend systems. So we definitely love to geek out on the crypto on the proper cryptography side of things. But to me, I think having sort of a cryptographic first class access control in a fully properly decentralized way means that we can truly build the vision for a real decentralized Web3, right? So this isn't kind of one of these fake Web3, centralized Web3 type of a deal. So I guess one of the things I'd love for you to comment on is a little bit about things like social graph and decentralized social networks, because I think there's some really interesting applications there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I think an interesting lens is to ask, like, what's the most valuable asset on the internet? And this is a gross oversimplification, but you can almost think about NFTs as taking assets that existed inside of games and then making them, quote, platformless, pulling them outside of the gaming platform and making them a piece of basically merchandise in many cases that an individual can own, not through legal contracts, but own through encryption. So what you're getting at is quite important, because it's I don't think it's too far of a leap to, if you ask the question, what's the most valuable asset on the internet, to say that it's the social graph. And so the momentum around being able for each individual to take their node, their like list of friends and connections that they have, and have that something that they own and is self-sovereign, and again, they own through encryption, is kind of the momentum in the direction that we're headed in. And what's nice there is the notion of access control basically means that you can consent to different individuals to decrypt your posts on whatever platform you choose, or consent to these applications to use some of the data in this kind of like log in with the crypto wallet momentum we were just talking about a moment ago. But really, a lot of this story is just around, in this next kind of epoch of the internet, what it looks like for the individual to really claim and hold some of the power. And this is less of a technical point, but one thing that I'm really excited to see unfold over kind of the next decade is just the psychological implication of when you're walking around on the web, moving from being like I'm a row in somebody's database is a much more kind of subservient position from like an authority dynamic to I have something that's mine here and I'm letting them use it and can pull it away as I see fit and if I'd like to.
Yeah, I would love to kind of throw out one of the words that you were using, right? Which to me, I think so just to let the audience in a little bit on some of this culture, right? Which is that one of the things that people really kind of have a funny reaction to in the cryptographic segment is really when you meet kind of hardcore cryptographers, right? Now, obviously, there's sort of enterprise cryptography, RSA conference and all the suits and the ties, but we're really talking about kind of like Mohawk, like cypherpunk cryptography, and like when you go there, like you meet lots of funny people who are like playing with the different consent frameworks and paradigms, right? So I mean, it gets a little spooky and people kind of like think a lot about kind of like how insanely adversarial the infrastructure is. But the thing that's so amazing about what David's saying is that there's another culture coming from open source software, which is kind of completely only, it's sort of consent only, right? So in a sense, like, really intense cryptography supports really intense consent under really adversarial circumstances, right? So, and when I say under really adversarial circumstances, the thing that people need to understand is that infrastructure has to support the worst case, the most hyper adversarial case, because it's infrastructure, right? So you don't look at a highway and say, oh, my car is really light, so you overbuilt this bridge. It's too, because my car only needs a certain amount of bridge, and you just built a bridge that could handle a lot more than my car, right? It doesn't work like that. Like if you're building infrastructure, it has to support the most adversarial case. And what you're saying is the result of well-built cryptographic infrastructure is that everyone gets to consent, right? They get to consent about, oh, you can use my data, or no way, like you cannot use my data, right? And that kind of consent, I think, isn't available. And when you look at this idea of hyper adversariality, the idea that I can go to the dark web and buy 8 billion name password pairs, do you think any of those people consented for hackers to steal their passwords? Like, no, right? So is hyper adversary, like, we have to point at the reality of hyper adversariality, right? Like that's what's happening and that's why we're failing, right? So, in a sense, like this is where the new internet how it has to be built, right? And it has to be built with the right kind of mindset. So I guess one of the things I'm really curious about, and I ask everyone, is kind of like, what's your thing? Like, what's your like superpower? Like, how do you see, the role of, yourself in this whole thing?
Yeah, I'll jump back into that in a second. I just would love to comment on something that you just mentioned. It was really well articulated. And I mean, I think with this talk of the adversarial parties and encryption, it's easy to kind of get stuck in a line of questioning that goes, oh, but people don't really care about privacy. People use Facebook Messenger and not Signal. And to me, like that is not incorrect. There's like the notion of convenience is totally the driver of how many people will operate. But there's another incentive mechanism coming along that we know is picking up, which is the notion of tokenization. And there's a new breed of entrepreneurs that basically, like right now, you make a company, you can become profitable, you can be acquired, or you can IPO, where you may or may not be profitable at that state. And now there's this fourth option emerging, which is exit to community. And so in this kind of like exit to community lens, there seems to be an emerging idea, again, really aligned with the open source ideals and resilient infrastructure around how to not create that data honeypot that can be hacked, how to create some level of privacy through obscurity. And some of that involves giving the user sovereignty and the right to consent to different platforms to access their data. And so what I'm really excited about is that like stakeholders getting paid for use in their network through exit to community being the cultural lever that drives privacy rather than privacy being the thing that we all want to achieve. So we can like bring in privacy into our society through through user-owned networks, which is really exciting. But yeah, in terms of kind of my superpower, jumping back to the question, the the metaphor I like is kind of like the classic definition of the entrepreneur, which is how can you take a really pie in the sky vision, which is kind of where we're talking about,
Yep.
and think about where the lightning touches the ground. What is V0 of that thing? What are the first three steps of that thing? And that type of exercise, whether it's for stuff that we're working on with our awesome team, or when speaking with friends, I really love that kind of thinking.
I'm excited to hear that because, the metaphor of lightning is sort of very singularly beautiful for me, right? Because I often talk to entrepreneurs about what I call heaven and earth, right? Heaven is sort of the future. We've taken over the world. Web3 is built on top of like fully decentralized cryptographic authentication and access control, right? So like that's heaven, and of course, but Earth is like, okay, so what are you building today, right? And so like, practical execution in the now that kind of creates this future, right? And so I think this idea of lightning is such an amazing idea because in a way it's sort of like how heaven and earth are kind of joined together in a moment, right? So that's really this kind of a stroke of lightning. So one of the questions I always ask too is really related to sort of your own current motivation and inspiration. So what are the kind of, and this can be personal or professional,
Sure.
but I would love to kind of get the stuff that's juicy for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this being able to, and I think you really nailed it with kind of open source ethos and culture, and being able to kind of like build something that everybody can potentially use and that can let them as an individual kind of claim and hold more, power in air quotes, whatever, however you kind of define that. That is really deeply motivating. And in the in 2015 and 16, I was also kind of reading about the notion of platform cooperatives and Ethereum at the same time. And so we've been talking a lot about sovereignty and data control, which is a big piece, largely under like the bucket of decentralization. And then a highly related bucket is kind of the mimetic energy, if you will, around coordination. And there's clearly a relationship between decentralization and coordination. They're not the same thing. There's quite the dance going on there. And so there's a lot of motivation there around just like building new systems. I might not get the quote exactly right, but Buckminster Fuller has this quote that goes along something along the lines of like, uh, if you want to see people do something new in the world, don't tell them what to do. Give them the tool that lets them do the new thing. Again, that's not verbatim, but that's the general idea.
Yeah, I do like the flavor of this. I think that it's the future is definitely in the hands of these kind of builders, and I think for me, like I like this kind of imaginative invocation of Buckminster Fuller, who, absolutely is a source of inspiration for lots of creators. So you know, here's one is, who do you want to recognize, with a shout out. So, in terms of like community members, sort of technology providers, individuals, like, who do you think is who deserves some additional recognition?
Yeah, definitely want to shout out my co-founder, Chris Casano. So we have been on, this is a really exciting idea, and and the whole team is really excited to work on this. But um, Chris and I probably iterated through a half dozen different concepts for 2.5 years, which is a non-trivial thing to keep going and have faith around. Okay, something interesting is going to happen, but we're not exactly sure what the path, and being able to kind of like hold that uncertainty throughout that process, has made us quite close as business partners.
Yeah, that to me is such an interesting pattern. And I think you're describing, sort of the word faith, right? And in a way, to me, like, when we talk about kind of the creation of consent and we talk about freedom, right? So one of the fascinating things is that, individual freedom I think of as like, I do whatever I want, right? But like collective freedom comes more into the realm of things like we make the rules, slash together, right? So in a sense, like having a partnership like that is very unique because it sort of becomes, I would call it like a conviction flywheel. So I think you created something pretty unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also an interesting relationship between like faith and persistence. I'm also like less time these days, but have done some long backpacking trips in my life, and there's just something to be said, even when you're soaked from head to toe, just putting one foot in front of the other, and uh, yeah, there's it's just fun in a way to just kind of keep going in the face of the uncertainty. But there's a like in backpacking, when it's like raining and you've got like splinters and stuff like that, there's a term that they call type two fun. Like type one fun, the weather is great, everything's awesome. Like type two fun, everything sucks, but if you can still manage to smile, like it's kind of interesting and fun in its own right too.
That's very interesting and important, right? Because I think the journey of entrepreneurship, it's without question has ups and downs, right? So there's a very strong kind of personal attitude of perseverance. I think ultra high conviction. One of the things that I've been fortunate to be privy to is sort of our weekly calls, right? So I think one of the things that's really beautiful that I see happening is that, in a way, like you're in more like the kind of you're on the ridge and you're getting the views now, right? In the sense that this isn't the kind of trudge through the dark forest with all the bugs. That this is actually reaching the point where you're starting to see a lot of vistas, right? So I think the excitement is pretty tangible right now.
Yeah, I like that metaphor a lot. And it kind of like there's something about being on the ridge or having the macro view. If you think about like standing on top of a ridge and looking down into a valley, you can clearly delineate where the line of the fog is. But then you go down in the valley and you're in it, the line doesn't exist. The delineation
Yeah.
or the insight maybe only exists from the top of the ridge, to kind of extend that metaphor a little bit.
No, I really appreciate this, and it's especially poignant for me because, like, I remember back when we were first talking about my fun Gumi getting involved in Lit Protocol, and you and I actually went to the Montara Beach, and we took a hike actually up basically up a ridge, and we actually got some astonishing views from up high. So it really kind of like makes me remember that. So one of the things that I think this segues beautifully into is kind of the big idea. So we've already kind of touched on this, and I think it's a really, I think of you as a visionary founder, but to me, like succinctly put, Steve Jobs really came to the world with this idea that was as simple as personal computing. Like that was all really he started with, and he really kept on going. And I think his legacy is for computing to become even more personal, probably a little too personal, right? But I think that, it's really just an amazing story arc, to be so correct about such a big idea. So, I guess the thing I'm curious about is sort of what is your big idea,
Yeah.
and how do you see this playing out in the future?
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit less wholesome, but like the word that comes up here is triage. Um, and what I mean by that is like there's a situation that's happening that is like non-optimal and non-savory in a lot of ways in terms of the treatment of people's data. Like climate is an example of this. It's not like how can we get to the shining city on top of the hill. It's just like, how can we even course correct? And so, in terms of the big idea, I'll give you kind of like a comparison. So Tim Berners-Lee has this project called Solid, and he invents the web and basically goes, this is great, and then all of a sudden, this isn't so great. Wouldn't it be great if everybody had their own personal server that they could consent data from? And I would say like the general momentum around Web3 totally sees the same problem, but instead of going, you should rent a server from Amazon and own it in a contractual point of way, just use public storage and own your quote unquote server, or we internally call them like a hub, not through paper contracts, but through encryption. And so the notion that somebody not just their on-chain information and their ability to move the assets in and out of their wallet and call functions from their wallet, but the idea that somebody has a self-sovereign space that is their space that they're granting consent in and out of. I think that's the big idea.
Yeah, I really think that is it's a tremendous idea, right? Because I think for me, when you think about problems, right? One of the problems in our world right now is that in some ways there is a lack of integrity in the world, and I think that this lack of integrity really often takes the form of these externalities, right? So, when you look at an economic externality, it's really just some organization or group that's trying to kind of do their own thing, but that they're really ignoring the negative results of what they're doing, that's visited on everyone else, right? So obviously things like global warming, and kind of we're in a planet that's rapidly approaching 8 billion people,
Mhm.
in a sense, like the limits of individual freedom become even more noticeable, where like, people's individual freedom starts to immediately impinge upon consent and the rights of others, right? So to me, like when you talk about kind of like of like bringing the world into more integrity, I think that in a sense, the two things, when you use the word coordination earlier, that I think are exciting is that what we're really talking about is kind of coordination of consent, right? Which is related to things like DAO voting and things like that. So coordination of consent is super interesting, but like what may be even more interesting is coordination of financial energy,
Mhm.
right? And coordination of people's values, right?
Mhm.
So, if you look at the idea of tokenized externalities, there's 1,000 projects, probably half of them are more fraudulent that are doing carbon tokens, things of that nature,
Right.
and
Mhm.
saying a lot of them are fraudulent isn't kind, but some of them are inept as well. But out of that big grab bag, there may actually be some viable solutions,
Yeah.
and for me, if you think about tokenized externalities, it means that people's consent and their values, as well as their kind of intentions and votes, and all of this stuff becomes coordinated with financial energy, right? And
Yeah.
that part I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, I think this like what participated in Constitution DAO and like as this kind of early use case around coordinated financial collective action. I think is only getting more exciting, and certainly like let's all get together and buy something is one like function or mechanism of let's all get together. To kind of like tie it back to the notion of having a self-sovereign hub of your data, that enables the kind of collective action where you can say, hey, we're this group of 100,000 people and all of our data is portable. We're using your platform today, but like you don't own us in the same way that Facebook owns their users. We're all going to decide together to do financial collective action because we're going to pool our money and fund this competitor to yours because they have some kind of rule or system that is more aligned with our values. So I think like certainly let's go out and buy a thing is super cool, and then more sophisticated actions of what you can do with the pooling of financial capital will emerge. And I do see some of that being built on the notion of individuals' data being portable as and private as like these more sophisticated use cases start to come into the world.
Yeah, and I think to me, so I love that you're shouting out Constitution DAO. We actually had as our previous guest an as yet unreleased MikoBits episode with Graham Novak, who tells the story of Constitution DAO and the kind of crazy 7 day coordination of like, 40 some $1 million worth of, community energy, towards buying the Constitution. So, look out for that episode. But like, to me, the thing that I think is really intriguing about this kind of world that you're depicting, is absolutely one that is kind of inseparable from the vision of the metaverse. So I really do resist the term metaverse, but what I really am starting to talk about is sort of uh, human centric or user centric transmedia, right? And obviously when we talk about centrism, there's sort of fan centric transmedia or there's gamer centric transmedia, and so there's different kinds of cultural centers for transmedia, right? And to me, when I think about it from that lens, then the thing that becomes really important is that like the facets of identity really become wrapped around the user, right? So there's the user, then there are their identities, and then the identities actually allow them to appear in environments, and so what better way of thinking about things like NFTs is basically like almost like avatars, but also as keys, right? So in a sense, like, this is all inseparable from the metaverse in the sense that someone can be like, well, I want to appear in this environment as a Bored Ape, and I want to go to a different environment and appear there as a CryptoPunk, right? And obviously, if the NFT itself is actually being used as an access key, then you suddenly have authenticity, right? Suddenly it's like, oh no, that's CryptoPunk 12. Like that, that is actually the one, right? And the environment enforces it and the gateway enforces it. So I think that's, a wonderful kind of vision.
It makes it real for sure. And yeah, and it's just like I think that the the whole idea that like the notion of digital ownership and this public credential system and decentralized ledger that we have in blockchains, it's really I think like the term red pill, is an apt one. It's really just an expansive kind of new view or lens, and an exciting one.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think coordination of consent, coordination of financial power, measurement of financial externalities, the emergence of a sort of a future-proof, cryptographically secure, defended against this hyper adversarial environment, this new infrastructure for what people are calling Web3, is truly sort of going to create an exponential solution. And I think the exponentiality and the exponential rise of the economic value in blockchain can actually serve as a mechanism to face some of the exponential challenges, right? So when you talked about triage, when you think about solving exponential challenges like global climate change and these types of things, like we definitely need to look for, really exponential solutions. I mean, it
Yeah.
turns out that the kind of normal approaches don't seem to be having a sufficient effect in the sufficient timeline.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some pretty interesting ideas kicking around as it relates to this type of thing. And I think like the other thing is like climate is a big one. How do you price in externalities? And obviously income inequality is quite high to the top of that list of these kind of exponential problems. And like this notion of user-owned networks, you hear people talk about what would it look like if Uber was owned by the drivers, and it's like, oh, but Uber pays the drivers and YouTube pays the creators, but right now, like the main value is created in the network effect value, is at the platform value. So I really think, and not to use the word key in too many different ways, but the key to this thing is kind of the builders and the entrepreneurs and the founders finding a level of values alignment and hopefully being able to see the forest through the trees and recognize that by giving up some of the authority and the take rate to the users, to the stakeholders, in the future, if there's a good product market fit, and obviously there's a lot of things, likely you will build a much bigger network that will have more impact and potentially have more of a financial upside as well. And so to me, that's the thing that I'm really tracking closely and looking at and talking to a lot of my peers. And I'm really optimistic in terms of that kind of of culture around user-owned networks. And even NFT projects are a great kind of simplistic example of these, where it's like, okay, it's functionally a membership card, and there's cool stuff you can do with it, and there's an in-group and an out-group. But the all of the individuals are having the economic benefit, and it's the core team that is building the infrastructure, making it work in the metaverse with access control, using lit protocol to have exclusive merch drops on Shopify, whatever it might be. And so you've got 3 or 4 people who are doing the work, and 6,000 holders who are benefiting from it. So I kind of it's nice to see that, because that in that and a lot of people say like, oh, this is so insane, this money is wild, but from the lens of all of the users in the network being able to generate value, and the founders basically, and the teams behind these NFT projects sharing that and saying like, this is your IP, you can do with it what you want as long as you hold the token. That feels like the right energy. But if you couldn't already tell, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, no, and I think that, builders have to have optimism, otherwise they'll kind of throw up their hands. So I think we are kind of all biased towards builders, and I think that it's really admirable what you're doing. So I think we've come up onto the end of the show, but I think I just want to give you a quick send-off question around sort of your launch. So, this video will be released concurrently. So I think you're able to say, like, what is it that was announced
Yeah.
in
So
the launch?
we are announcing a fundraise. Miko and his team are participating, along with a bunch of other aligned investors and contributors who are quite aligned with this notion of emergent value through decentralization and tokenization and sovereignty. So really excited about that. And as part of that, if you're listening to this within maybe a couple of days of the launch, on Lit Gateway, we have a NFT giveaway for the launch. And once you claim that NFT, which is totally free, there's a bunch of use cases that you can see. You can use that NFT to unlock token gated videos and spaces in GatherTown, and files and merch on Shopify. So we've kind of built that as a reference implementation, and it's free to claim. There's 10,000 of them. So that's a pretty fun way to get involved and claim a role in Discord as well.
Yeah. And just my final editorial commentary, right, which is that in a way, like, the future is a bit uncertain, but what I can tell you is that if you are a holder of one of these first 10,000 free Lit Gateway tokens, like, there's any number of pretty exciting potential offers and experiences that could be open to you in the future. So, I definitely encourage you to go claim your free NFT and be one of the first 10,000 Lit Gateway population, people populating this new metaverse
Right.
of Web3 access control.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the kind of the immediate benefits is when you claim the NFT, you can click on it. It's HTML NFT, kind of functions as a portal. And once you're inside of the portal, we've got a collaborative pixel art project in there. And then 30 days after the launch, we'll turn that into a one-of-one NFT and gift it to one of the contributors at random, which will be pretty fun too.
I love it. I think that'll be fun. There's an art angle, there's an access angle, and I think, to me, if you're involved at all in kind of the NFT world, you're really going to want to play with this technology so you can understand that an NFT is more than just a JPEG, but that it actually is something that gives you access to a whole world, either on Web3 or even on in Web2 systems. So definitely check it out. So David, thanks so much for joining the Miko Bits show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Miko.